February 14, 1945. Camp John Hay, Northern Luzon, Philippines. Ruby Bradley pressed the blade against torn flesh, her hands steady despite the tremor in her arms. The scalpel had been hidden in the hem of her uniform for 18 months. Around her, prisoners held the young Marine down while she worked by the light of a single stolen bulb. Japanese guards paced outside the makeshift clinic. The boy was 19. Shrapnel from an American bombing run had opened his leg. Without surgery, he would die of sepsis within days. She had only the blade, her training, and the knowledge that if the guards discovered what she was doing, they would kill her and everyone in the room. What she did in the following weeks would determine whether more than 1,000 prisoners lived or died, and whether a Japanese massacre would be stopped in time. But what Ruby Bradley understood after 3 years of captivity was that survival required small, deliberate acts of defiance performed in absolute silence. Ruby G. Bradley was a U.S. Army nurse who spent nearly 4 years as a prisoner of war in the Philippines during World War II. In that time, she performed covert surgeries, delivered babies, smuggled food to starving children, and coordinated intelligence that saved hundreds of lives. She did this while weighing less than 90 pounds. She did it without recognition, without supplies, and often without hope. Her story is not taught in textbooks. Her name does not appear in most histories of the Pacific War. But inside the wire of Camp John Hay in Santo Tomas, Ruby Bradley kept people alive when the world had given them up for dead. This is the story of how she did it, and why almost no one knows. Ruby Grace Bradley was born in 1907 in Spencer, West Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner. She grew up in a town where mine collapses and black lung were facts of life, where women learned early to manage wounds and grief with equal composure. Ruby was practical, quiet, and unshakable. At 18, she enrolled in nursing school in Philadelphia. By 1934, she had joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. It was steady work, rare for a woman at the time, and it came with a measure of respect she had not known growing up. In 1940, the Army sent her to Camp John Hay in the Philippines, a small post in the mountains of Luzon. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment. The climate was mild. The hospital was small. The war, if it came at all, seemed far away. Then, on December 8, 1941, Japan attacked the Philippines. Ruby was at the hospital when the first bombs fell. Within hours, the road to Manila was cut. Communication with the outside world ceased. The commanding officer ordered a retreat into the mountains. Ruby and a handful of other nurses stayed behind with the wounded. They thought the Japanese would treat medical personnel according to international law. They were wrong. On December 27, 1941, Japanese forces overran Camp John Hay. Ruby and the other nurses were taken prisoner. The soldiers stripped the hospital of supplies, confiscated their medical instruments, and marched the staff into a barbed wire compound. Ruby was 34 years old. She would not see freedom again until she was 38. The early months were the hardest to endure. Not because of violence, but because of the slow realization that no one was coming. The camp held American and Filipino soldiers, some British civilians, a handful of missionaries, and a few dozen children. Food rations were cut to a single bowl of rice per day. Malaria swept through the barracks. Dysentery became epidemic. The clinic had no medicine, no bandages, no clean water. Ruby organized what she could. She tore her own shirts into gauze. She boiled water in stolen pots. She convinced a sympathetic guard to look the other way, while she scavenged discarded medical waste from the Japanese hospital nearby. She found a scalpel in a trash heap, cleaned it, and sewed it into the seam of her uniform. She knew she would need it eventually. By 1943, Ruby weighed less than 100 pounds. Her uniform hung loose. Her hands shook from malnutrition. But her mind remained sharp. She memorized which guards could be bribed, which prisoners could be trusted, and which children were in the most danger. There were infants in the camp born to imprisoned mothers. Some had been separated from their parents. Ruby made it her mission to keep them alive. She smuggled rice from the kitchens, one handful at a time, hidden in the folds of her skirt. She mashed it into a paste and fed it to the youngest children by hand. She stole powdered milk from the guards' rations and mixed it with water to make formula. When a baby developed a fever, she stayed awake for 3 nights straight, cooling the child with wet rags and checking for convulsions. Once, when a toddler's fever spiked dangerously, Ruby had no medicine left. She approached a guard she knew had children, pretending she needed extra water for laundry, and he hesitated just long enough for her to slip the ration to the sick boy instead. 19 of the children she cared for survived the war. Most of them would never know her name. In mid-1944, the situation worsened. American forces were advancing through the Pacific, and the Japanese began to see the prisoners as liabilities. Guards became more erratic. Beatings increased. Prisoners were sometimes forced to stand for hours in the yard as punishment, swaying under the sun until they collapsed. Ruby watched these scenes in silence, knowing any attempt to intervene would endanger everyone. Food rations were cut again. Rumors spread that the camp would be liquidated before the Americans arrived. Ruby understood what that meant. She began to prepare for the worst. She hid surgical tools in the walls of the clinic. She taught other nurses how to perform emergency amputations. She organized a network of prisoners who could carry messages between barracks without attracting attention. The camp became a web of small, invisible acts of resistance. One evening in late 1944, a prisoner brought Ruby a note. It had been passed through the fence by a Filipino resistance fighter. The note contained a single line: "Tell us when they plan to move you." Ruby burned the note and memorized the contact protocol. From that point on, she became the camp's link to the outside world. That winter, Ruby performed her first covert surgery. A young soldier had developed an abscess in his abdomen. Without intervention, he would die within days. But performing surgery would mean risking discovery. The guards had made it clear that medical procedures required their approval, and they rarely gave it. Ruby waited until midnight. She gathered her hidden tools. She enlisted 2 other prisoners to hold the man down. She worked by candlelight, with no anesthetic, while another prisoner stood watch at the door. The surgery took 40 minutes. The man survived. Ruby stitched him up with thread pulled from a blanket and told him not to speak of it. As she cleaned the blade, a guard suddenly stepped into the doorway, and for a moment she was certain the entire operation had been discovered. She would perform 11 more surgeries over the next 6 months. None of them were recorded. None of them were approved. All of them succeeded. But what would test her most was still to come. In early February 1945, American forces were closing in on northern Luzon. Inside Camp John Hay, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Japanese officers held whispered meetings. Guards burned documents. The prisoners knew what was being discussed: the systematic execution of everyone inside the wire. The plan was simple. When American troops reached the valley below, the guards would kill all prisoners, destroy the records, and retreat into the mountains. There would be no witnesses, no survivors, no evidence. Ruby learned of the plan from a Filipino laborer who worked in the guards' quarters. He risked his life to pass her the information. Ruby knew she had to act, but she also knew she had no leverage. She was a prisoner. She had no weapons. She had no authority. What she did have was time. Ruby began to delay. When the guards asked for a roster of prisoners, she claimed the records had been damaged. When they demanded a health report, she invented complications that required further review. She stretched every task, every question, every bureaucratic requirement into hours instead of minutes. She was buying time for the resistance network to relay information to advancing American forces. One night, a Filipino messenger slipped through the fence and found Ruby in the clinic. He asked for the camp's exact location, the number of prisoners, and the guard rotations. Ruby provided all of it. She also told him about the planned massacre. The message reached an American battalion moving through the valley, men who had no idea how close they were to walking into an unseen slaughter. 3 days later, on the morning of February 11, 1945, an American reconnaissance unit approached Camp John Hay from the east. The force advancing toward the camp was battalion strength, and without Ruby's warnings, they would have walked into a prepared kill zone. They moved carefully, avoiding the main roads, circling wide to cut off the guards' retreat. At dawn on February 12, the Americans reached the camp perimeter. They did not fire. Instead, they set up loudspeakers and broadcast a message in Japanese, offering the guards safe passage if they surrendered the prisoners unharmed. The guards hesitated. Ruby, watching from the clinic window, understood that this was the moment. If the guards panicked, they would carry out the executions. If they delayed, the Americans would have time to negotiate. She walked out into the camp yard, in full view of both the guards and the American soldiers beyond the fence. She stood there, skeletal and unmoving, her nurse's uniform torn but still recognizable. She was making herself a witness, a symbol, a reminder that the world was watching. The guards did not fire. They lowered their weapons. They opened the gates. Over 1,000 prisoners walked out alive. Ruby Bradley weighed 86 pounds. The weeks after liberation were a blur. Ruby was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a ship, then to a base in San Francisco. She was examined by doctors, debriefed by intelligence officers, and photographed by military journalists. She answered their questions with the same calm precision she had used in the camp. She did not embellish. She did not exaggerate. She simply stated what had happened. The Army recognized her service. She was awarded the Bronze Star, and later the Legion of Merit. The citations mentioned her exceptional devotion to duty and her tireless care of the sick and wounded. But the specific details, the surgeries, the smuggling, the intelligence work, The moment she stood in the yard to prevent a massacre were classified or omitted. Ruby did not protest. She returned to duty. In 1950, she volunteered for Korea. She served as chief nurse at a MASH unit near the front lines, working under fire, performing triage in conditions that were in some ways worse than the camps. She was promoted to colonel, one of the few women to reach that rank at the time. She retired in 1963 as the most decorated woman in U.S. military history. But the decorations told only part of the story. What they did not capture was the quiet, relentless courage of a woman who saved lives not with grand gestures but with small, invisible acts performed in the darkest corners of the war. Ruby Bradley never sought recognition. She never wrote a memoir. She rarely spoke about the camps. When asked about her service, she would say only, "I did what any nurse would do." But that was not true. What Ruby Bradley did was far more than nursing. She organized resistance. She defied orders. She risked execution to keep strangers alive. She delayed a massacre with nothing but her presence and her refusal to look away. And for decades, almost no one knew. Ruby Bradley died in 2002 at the age of 94. Her obituary ran on page 12 of the local paper. There were no national headlines, no presidential tribute, no documentary film. The archives that might have told her story remained sealed or scattered. The prisoners she saved had grown old and passed away. The children she fed had forgotten her name. But in the final years of her life, a small group of historians and veterans began to piece together what she had done. They found the hidden records. They interviewed the survivors. They discovered the coded messages, the smuggled supplies, the midnight surgeries, and the moment she stood in the camp yard and made herself a shield. She had shaped its outcome in ways that went unrecorded. Today, there is a statue of Ruby Bradley at the U.S. Army Women's Museum in Fort Lee, Virginia. It shows her in uniform, carrying a medical bag, her expression calm and resolute. Visitors walk past it without pausing. Most do not know who she is. But for those who do know, the statue is not a monument. It is a question. How many others like her were there, standing in the shadows of history, holding the line while the world moved on?